In an autobiographical sketch that appeared in the Saturday Evening Post when Rose Wilder Lane was already a successful writer, she observed that I have been office clerk, telegrapher, newspaper reporter, feature writer, advertising writer, farmland salesman. An interesting career. It began when Lane moved from Mansfield, Missouri to Kansas City and eventually on to San Francisco, and married Claire Gillette Lane, known as Gillette, in 1909. He was a reporter for the San Francisco Call. The couple moved to Kansas City briefly, then returned to San Francisco, where Lane's journalism career blossomed. We'll talk more a little later about Lane's journalism career and her mother's, but I will say this. Lane became an almost overnight success. During the 1920s, she became a prominent literary figure and one of the highest paid American women writers in the country. She entertained literary celebrities, sometimes at Rocky Ridge Farm, when she visited from Europe. Also during this period, she wrote 2 novels about the Missouri Ozarks, Cindy and Hillbilly. She and Gillette lost their only son, born in 1910, and were divorced in 1918 after a lengthy separation. It's unclear whether their child died shortly before or after his birth, but later in life, Lane seemed to be searching for the son she'd lost. She took several young men under her wing, providing financial and emotional support for them, and considered them her adopted sons, including a young Albanian Muslim boy who was killed during World War II, 2 teenage boys from the Ozarks who showed up at the back door of Rocky Ridge Farm looking for work during the 1930s, and Roger Lee McBride, whom Lane adopted as a grandson in the 1940s and named as her heir in the 1950s. Roger McBride went on to become Lane's literary agent and eventually her literary executor. He's largely responsible for publishing several of Wilder's works after her death, including On the Way Home in the first 4 years. McBride also played an instrumental role in bringing Little House on the Prairie to NBC during the 1970s as a television series. It's still in syndication today. But a few more details about Lane and her life. An assignment with the Red Cross took her to Europe, and she traveled extensively. She seemed drawn to the Balkans, especially Albania. Her book, Peaks of Shala, published in 1923, was set there. An Old Hometown includes an extended scene in Albania. Lane's admiration for the country comes through clearly. From every hillside, one could hear the shepherd's pipes and the faintly tinkling bells of flocks grazing on their way to the mountains. The shifting lights on the mountain wall, shutting off the eastern half of the sky, made breath catch in the throat. Lane never remarried, although she had a serious romantic entanglement with writer and journalist Guy Moyston. And there has been speculation about her relationship with her companion, Helen Boylston. Nicknamed Trub for all the trouble she seemed to get into, Helen Boylston was a nurse working for the Red Cross when she and Lane met in Europe shortly after the armistice of World War I. She and Lane bought a car together in 1926, named it Zenobia after a Bedouin queen, toured Albania together, and set up housekeeping there. Boylston followed Lane back to Rocky Ridge Farm and lived with her in the farmhouse in the late 1920s and early 1930s. They parted ways, not amicably, in late 1931. Lane described the breakup in a journal entry the following year. Trub announced her decision. At last, after 5 years of idleness, she was going to start out as a short story writer. I told her definitely I could not support her while she was doing it, and that she had better go to New York and get a nursing job while I still had the money to pay her fare. That was decided. Lane's diaries aren't explicit, but she sometimes hints at a relationship that was more than merely friendship. Here, for example, are two brief journal entries immediately after Trub left Rocky Ridge Farm for good. Trub is gone, left in the car at 10 a.m. after 6 years together. And last year was catastrophic. On Rocky Ridge alone, Trub gone. Then a few days later, Lane wrote this in a draft letter to her literary agent. I am not actually broke, but I contemplate that horrid future. Helen Boylston, who's been my partner for years, has at last been struck down by the Depression, like the soldiers killed on Armistice morning. I'm left with his household on my hands. It's doubtful whether I can manage it alone. The word partner, of course, is ambiguous. It did not carry the meaning in 1932 that it does for us in 2014. But Lane seems to be mourning the loss of something deeper and perhaps even more intimate, a romantic breakup rather than an argument with an old friend. Later, when Lane was back east taking care of business, Wilder wrote her daughter asking diplomatically whether Lane had seen Trub. Perhaps Wilder was worried about the breakup and what it meant to her daughter. Boylston is remembered now primarily as the author of the Sue Barton series, which debuted in 1936, after Boylston and Lane had parted ways. During the 1930s, Lane edited her mother's autobiography and the Little House novels themselves, something we'll talk about later. But she also wrote two successful novels based on her mother's pioneer material, Let the Hurricane Roar, which has been retitled as Young Pioneers, and Free Land. But Lane's career as a writer of fiction lost momentum as her mother's became more successful. She left Rocky Ridge Farm in 1935 and moved to Columbia, Missouri, to work on a history of Missouri which was never published. Ultimately, Lane moved to New York and then to Danvers, Connecticut in 1938, where she bought a small farmhouse, which she renovated and redecorated. And along the way, she abandoned writing fiction. Lane's interests turned from fiction to economic, social, and political theory, and in 1943, she published the book, The Discovery of Freedom, about her political convictions and her opposition to FDR and the New Deal. The book earned her recognition as one of the founding mothers of the libertarian movement. Her adopted grandson, Roger McBride, went on to become the Libertarian Party's presidential candidate in 1976. Laura Ingalls Wilder died in 1957 at the age of 90. Lane returned to the Ozarks to be at her mother's bedside at her death. Lane was deeply shaken. Writing to an old friend in Mansfield, Lane apologized for her behavior and the chaos she had left behind at Rocky Ridge Farm. She wrote, I hope after a while to be something like my right mind again, but really I was not responsible for anything during those last weeks there. In the years that followed, Lane wrote for Women's Day magazine, and in the 1960s, when she was in her late 70s, she accepted an assignment from the magazine and flew to the Republic of South Vietnam. The article, August in Vietnam, appeared in the December issue of Women's Day in 1965 and opened like this. No land on earth is more beautiful than Vietnam. The central mountain peaks climb blue beyond blue above dense forests and cleared slopes, where hamlets cluster in the villages and streams run swiftly. Below them, the South China Sea thrusts deep harbors between jungle-covered mountains reflected dark green in the clear water. Lane accepted an assignment from Women's Day 3 years later to fly around the world, reporting on issues of significance to their readers. But the night before she was scheduled to leave on this assignment, she died in her sleep at the age of 82. The last words she published appeared in August in Vietnam. We stay, we survive, because freedom is right, and right is everlasting. Lane had more than fulfilled the dreams of her alter ego, Ernestine, in Old Hometown. Rose Wilder Lane had moved well beyond the white road that went past the cemetery to faraway and unimagined places. And yet in death, she returned home. Like her mother and father, Rose Wilder Lane is buried in the cemetery in Mansfield, Missouri, her old hometown.